Okay. How is everybody? Does everybody like it here in Deadwood? I mean, this is a good spot, right? I like it. 50 miles from home, too. I like that part. I've given this talk a number of times, and the challenge is always to incorporate the new information without leaving behind the folks who have never heard any of it. And for a lot of folks who have heard it before, there's some repetition in it, and I think that's just necessary. So for those of you who have heard it before, please bear with me. And for those of you who haven't, jump in and hang on. Here we go. What is the GRSB? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's a nonprofit corporation. It's the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. It's incorporated under the laws of the state of Colorado. It has articles of incorporation and bylaws and members, just like any other corporation. It has all the trimmings and trappings of a legitimate outfit. The 501c3, of course, gives it nonprofit status. Doesn't mean it's a charity, and doesn't mean it's up to any good. The members sort of ebb and flow. I mean, there's a lot of people who were members who are no longer. They get new members and they drop out. They have various local roundtables, and you can fairly consider those to be similar to in the old Soviet Union. There was the Greater Soviet, and then there were lesser Soviets locally, and they were all under the sway of the Greater Soviet. So there's the big roundtable, global roundtable, then there's regional roundtables. So when you hear the GRSB claim their membership, what they're claiming is typically the total of all of those. But this is just a snapshot in time. These are the indispensable members of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, GRSB. You got the United Nations, you have Rabobank, and you have the World Wildlife Fund. And you might ask yourself at this point, why do any of those outfits pretend to know anything about beef? These are also important members. At the retail level, there's Walmart and McDonald's and others, many others. Walmart actually doesn't show up as a member anymore, but I think that's because their participation is so ingrained that they don't need to be there. You have the four major packers: Cargill, Tyson, Marfrig, and JBS. Marfrig is more locally known as National Beef. They have, between those four packers, they have 85% of the kill. You've heard that before, that's true. 85% of the cattle have to go through those four people. GRSB is not, if you may think it sounds lofty and well-intentioned, it's not. It's not a marketing program that's going to pay you a premium. It's not another stupid environmental award. It's not anything resembling a voluntary program. It's not transparent. You don't get to know what they're talking about. It's not a program driven by consumer choice or demand, and that's a huge factor that we'll talk about later. And it's not about something going on. Maybe you sit and you think, well, I don't want to denude the rainforest. I like those parrots, and I like all that. So maybe that's what they're doing. Maybe what they're worried about is deforestation in a place long ways away. It's not about that. It's about in your backyard. It is about an unprecedented attack on you and your family, and for sure your liberty, your private property without question, and your way of life. So if you like what you're doing, and you like what you have, and you like the folks you live with, these folks don't think that's important. And they are doing all they can to take that away from you. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Here's what the GRSB is really and truly. The Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is a platform to facilitate collusion against freedom-loving people. It's the smoke-filled room. Here the collusion is mostly aimed at beef producers and consumers. And they don't care about either one. Collusion is defined as, and I'm hurrying through this because there's some other new stuff here that's going to be more interesting for you guys, old folks. It's a secret or illegal cooperation or conspiracy, especially in order to cheat or deceive others. That's a dictionary definition. Here's what the GRSB is really doing. This is what they are really up to. This is what they are trying to accomplish. There's no dispute about this. This is where they're going. Now, they won't tell you this, but this is where they're going, and you can discover those facts. They want all producers to install a mandatory radio frequency identification in every animal you ever intend to sell. At birth. They want to register that against that number, that unique number. They want to register that against your premises so that essentially it's a passport for that animal to live on the property that it's registered to. Okay, so if you have leased land, they want you to, you've got to disclose that. And your RFID has to match the real estate that animal lives on. It's about totally unnecessary social and environmental regulations that they are imposing on you. And it's about compliance checklists, your compliance with those regulations, those totally unnecessary regulations. The compliance is checked by a third-party verifier, a contractor that you will hire to go out to your place and check and satisfy that contractor that you are in compliance with the regulations handed to them to check you for. And if you happen to be fortunate enough to pass their certification, pass their checklist, then you get a certification, and that allows that ear tag access to the market. And if that ear tag doesn't have a certification attached with it or to it, then you don't get to market that animal. So that's when I said it's not voluntary. And it only applies to the animals you ever want to sell. So you wonder, who's the mastermind? Who's the guy driving this whole train? Who's the point man? It's this guy. His name is Dr. Jason Clay. He works for the World Wildlife Fund. And here's what he has to say about
our strategies has always been to take choice away from consumers. Basically, our point is that consumers shouldn't have a choice about sustainability. And the way to do that is to get companies to only buy sustainable raw materials. We need to rehabilitate degraded and underperforming land to take pressure off of natural habitat. And we need to think about consumption. Some places need to consume more, others need to consume less. What it means is that you start measuring what matters. You require third-party verification of that measurement, and you get producers started on a stepwise approach towards continuous improvement. Our approach has really been to work in the supply chain itself to help companies identify better sources, source from producers that are certified, that have reduced measurably their environmental impacts, et cetera. What we've started doing is saying, okay, maybe sustainability isn't a competitive issue. Maybe consumers shouldn't have choice about sustainability. Maybe all the products on the shelf ought to be sustainable. How do we make that happen? We make that happen by getting companies to collude around sustainability. You start measuring what matters. You require third-party verification of that measurement. Once we start measuring stuff, we'll start managing it.
Of course, the stuff they want to manage is you. You know, I was a prosecutor for 8 years, a little more than 8 years. And in order to prove up a crime, there's a list of things, you enter for burglary, you enter or remain in an enclosure with the intent to steal something or commit a felony. So you got to prove each one of those things. And if this was if he was charged with a crime, and he should be, he would have just confessed to everything material to that crime. Collusion, now he used the word, that's why I threw in the definition. It's a secret or illegal cooperation or conspiracy, especially to cheat or deceive others. Now, why would a smart guy like him use the word collusion when he could have said cooperation? If he wasn't just so cocky and smug. If he wasn't just such a despicable creature who, here's what he's doing. He says, I'm gonna go about taking what you have, and I'm telling you right now, me and my buddies are doing it together. We're going to cheat you. We're going to deceive you. We're going to take your ranch. That's what he just said. Why would they do this? Why would they do this? Because you would think that it would be in their best interest to have a healthy, vibrant ranching community. That's not what they think. The answer depends on who you're talking about. They each have their own private motivations. These guys operate in the hierarchy of power globally. These guys are operating the UN and the World Wildlife Fund at probably about the third tier. Rabobank is a co-conspirator at the highest level of power. So what these guys get out of this deal is control. They're going to end up controlling that real estate, your assets, your family, you, your money, your ranch, your cattle. But what about these other guys? So what's Walmart and McDonald's get out of the deal? Well, here's what they get. They get funding from the bank. That's the bottom line, because if they don't do what they are told to do, they will be defunded by the bank. They will be out of business. Now, I just I'll throw this out here. Tyson, for instance, and don't hold me to these numbers, but it's like for every $100 of assets they have, 85 of those assets are debt, and 15 of them are equity. So you can see that it doesn't take very much swing in the availability of capital to tip Tyson over. So if a major lender, major financer, happened to withdraw their capital, it wouldn't have to withdraw very much before they were illiquid. So that has that has Tyson's attention, it has Walmart's attention, it has McDonald's attention. McDonald's has about 38,000 stores. They get 2,000 people through each one every day. And they can't do very much at any one of those stores to make any more money. That's just what it is. Where they make their money and where they get their growth is by building another store somewhere. And of course, they do that with debt capital. So absolutely, access to finance is motivating these people straight down the line. But the bankers give them a story too. They say, I'll tell you what, here's what you can do. We will make you king of what you do. We will make you the undisputed rulers of what you do if you only will do what we say. And let me just say, if you don't do that, we will kill you. And I mean that figuratively, I think. I think what they mean is, we're going to give that money to somebody else. Is there something special about McDonald's or Walmart, for that matter, other than their sheer scope and volume? I mean, there's something special about their food. McDonald's, I haven't eaten there in a long time, but it was especially bad, I thought. It really kind of an insult to beef, frankly. How about the Packers? What do they get out of it? Well, here's what they get out of it. It's kind of the same deal as the retailers. You know, you think about what these guys do, and their business models are all almost identical. They do the same thing. There's like 24 packing plants in the country. All of them are about the same size. They all, process like 5% of the total, each of the plants. Marfrig is about half or National Beef, we'll just call it National for the sake of this conversation. Marfrig's a Brazilian company, so is JBS. Cargill, Tyson, these guys, the big three, Cargill, Tyson, and JBS are about 25% of the total altogether. And National's about half as big as any one of them. So how'd they get this way? Because they're all the same. I mean, they all do the same thing. None of them has a better technology. How they got this way is through merger and acquisition. They gobbled up their competitors, and they were able to do that because the bankers chose them for that role. So they you read about it all the time, and when you do, you read about a merger, and it's like, Romeo and Juliet's families finally got together and they had a big marriage, and everybody's happy. It's a big deal. JBS gobbles up somebody, share stock goes up. It's a happy event. Well, the fact of the matter is that it tightens the supply chain into a choke point, into a bottleneck, and that's what it represents. So what they get out of this deal is they get to get big, they get to get monopoly type profits, and I know that's not the exact right word, but they can squeeze the retailers and they can squeeze the suppliers. So that they get that out of the deal. And if they don't do what the bankers say, they fail. So it's like, there's an expression in the mob world, I think it was the Russian mob, it's the bullet or the Benz. So people go to the person in the protection racket and they say, well, we'll tell you what we'll do for you. We'll either buy you this, here's the keys to a brand new Mercedes-Benz, you can drive it away, it's all yours. Or here's the bullet and we'll put it through your head. It's a stark choice. And that's what these guys are facing. 85% of the total. So you're probably all familiar with vertical integration. I won't spend a lot of time, but the Tyson model, Don Tyson sort of invented for packing plant purposes vertical integration, where he owns every stage of production from top to bottom, with the exception of the grow houses that he allows sharecroppers to operate. And so if somebody comes in and they want to be a chicken farmer, they go to Tyson. Tyson will line them up with financing. They go into big debt. Tyson tells them exactly how they're going to operate their grow facility. Brings them the chicks, brings them the feed. They come back and pick up the chicks when they're chickens. They butcher them, they go look on their grid, and they pay these guys according to how those chickens performed against all the other chickens that day. So the important thing about the vertical integration is there's one check at the end of this whole thing, and that goes to Tyson when they sell it at retail, or when they sell it to the retailer. And that's the only place where the chicken ever has to compete against anything, or where there's actually a market force at work. So normally in a command or in a market-driven economy, every stage of production is subject to competition and judgment and people's stake in their own business. And if you have a mile of fence to fix, you might decide it's too ratty and go spend the $10,000 to build that, or you might just say, I can make it work because I got 3 kids that'll work hard. We can go out there and put that ratty old wire back up, and we'll have a fence, and we'll spend some labor, but we won't have to lay out the capital. And you make an efficiency decision, and I'm not saying either one of those are the wrong thing to do, but it's what works for them, and in the bottom line, creates an efficiency to the whole. So what happens when they get a check at the end is then they go through it in the form of an accounting process, and they decide how much of that check to allocate to the chick, to the egg, to the breeder, to the grow house, and they decide what these folks are going to make. So what happens when you have vertical integration is it kills competition, and it kills all the price signals, and it kills the freedom. Okay, you no longer have the ability to make that decision about your fence. So, and there's a very crude diagram of what I just said. Tyson owns it all except for that grow facility. And if the grower doesn't do exactly what Tyson says, then they jerk their contract. And the guy's left sitting there with no place to go with chickens and a huge debt. So these are some, this is in England, where they have vertical integration. And what these producers have to do if they think they're entitled to more money is they have to go beg to the retailer for more money. That's what happens when you have a command and control, vertically integrated market. So what's in it for these guys? The beef checkoff and the NCBA. So however uncomfortable that notion may be to you right now, NCBA gets, and the beef checkoff spends, millions and millions and millions of your tax, or of your, I call them tax dollars, they are, your beef checkoff dollars to promote this program. They are, well, honest to God, NCBA wouldn't be in business if they had to rely on their membership dues. They wouldn't be in business. They are handmaidens to these packers. And what they get out of this transaction is they get to stand another day and get another beef checkoff check. And so they're willing to do what they're told, and they do. So they're out promoting this sustainability thing's a really great deal. It's it's Gerald was talking to my wife this morning, and he said that the title of the Colorado affiliate of NCBA, they have their meeting, and it's something like, sustainability and animal welfare and blah, 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 blah. So these guys are in on hook, line, and sinker, and they'll do anything they can to promote the packers' interests, except in those times when it is so blatantly obvious that they are stabbing the producer in the back again, where they can't do it and maintain any credibility. They may switch over and represent the producer side of it, but overwhelmingly, they stand on the side of the packers. And here's an example of what the World Wildlife Fund and the Beef Checkoff are doing. This was I think about 2013, but it was a brochure where the World Wildlife Fund and the Beef Checkoff partnered on some sustainability workshops. The NCBA put out this beautiful magazine with just embarrassing science and pictures of pretty girls in California riding their horses in pastel colors. The sun just, shaded off their face just so. And they spent millions of dollars on this, selling the program. NCBA, of course, has taken the Humane Society's underlying premise and incorporated it into their own doctrine. I can explain that more later, but these were two logos. The Humane Society's had this logo for a while, but NCBA thought they'd just crack out with a black and white one just to look like these guys. So I want you to consider the case of a transnational private government. And, a government typically, and I'll get to that slide, but a government typically does two things. They make rules and they enforce rules. And my thinking on this subject has evolved over the last year. And I see a distinction between governance and government. And if you want to listen to an interesting guy, Ian Davis, he has a podcast a blog called The Disillusioned Blogger. It has one subject called The Global Power Structure, iandavis.com. So he distinguishes between governance and government. Governance works with organizations like those big banks, like the UN, like the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, like the Council on Foreign Relations, those think tanks. And they come up with an overall trajectory for policy. And no country, like we're not in a very good position to write laws that affect Britain. But these guys shape the trajectory of the policy. And they not really hard and fast rulemaking, but more shaping the trajectory. And so then once the idea is articulated, then they market it generally to countries everywhere. And they essentially set the roadmap for the others to follow. And you see that with the Global Roundtable. The Global Roundtable can't actually throw you in jail, but the government can. So, but they set the policy, they set the roadmap. This is an example of governance. This is starting, I think, back in the 70s, but this is off the Federal Reserve's website. It's just shows the trend in mergers of banks. So there were a whole bunch of banks. Then there weren't very many, and now there's fewer. So there's like 6 banks in this country that have the overwhelming amount of the money, essentially all the money. And they are able to enact governance with that money, with the allocation of money, so starving people of financing or by letting it flow. So but the government is the enforcer. So how does the GRSB obtain that power of government? Because that's what they do. I mean, the GRSB is telling you guys, if you don't do what we say, we're going to deny you access to the market. That's like a government. So they need 2 things to really force their governance on you, and it's market concentration and collusion, and one more thing, it's mandatory traceability. And these are the 2 things they need to start directing your ranch. Running your ranch is a proper mix of collusion and market concentration, and you can see that. Okay, so if you only have 1 firm in the business, you don't need very much collusion. If you have 2, you need enough to get those 2 guys on the same, same page. If you got 10 different companies, you got to have a little more collusion, but it's a proper mix of what you've got for players and the amount of conversation that they have to have. And then you have the other thing they need is mandatory full chain RFID traceability. And if they get those 2 things, they can run your place. There's no more important thing to learn today than you just cannot accept mandatory traceability. And you have to fight it every time it rears its head. You know, and I used to, when I first started giving this talk, it was like maybe 8 years ago or so. And I used to go, well, you know, it's kind of a personal choice. Maybe there's some good things about it. And, you know, and my thinking has evolved on that over the years also. And if you want to do traceability, if you want to do an RFID air tag, that's a great management tool, I'll bet. I don't know. But that is your record. That record doesn't belong past your gate, and nobody has a right to it. And if you give them that right, you're asking for them to run your place. Now, in this last year, the GRSB published some global beef sustainability goals, and they're getting more adamant about what they expect from you. And in this particular instance, they talk about articulating their ambition and recognizing reality. But that third one there is important. They intend to compel your collaboration. And the thing that they've narrowed it down to about 3 things, because the broad umbrella of governance is, this unicorns and rainbows and all things wise and wonderful. But they boil it down, when they get to the specifics, they're boiling it down now to climate, your land use, and your animal welfare. And those are 3 things that the public has been able to identify as things that they believe are important. Here's another page of the, and I urge you to look this stuff up and read it, because some of it is pretty fantastic and unbelievable. It's as unbelievable as Jason Clay sitting there telling you, what we really need is collusion. It's as fantastic as that. So their goals are to work on traceability and transparency, and monitoring and reporting, and incentives. And I can tell, we'll talk about all these things in a little bit. But anytime they talk about an incentive, know that it's either cheese in the trap or it's a bait and switch altogether. These are organs of transnational power. These are some corporations on the left that are full on board. Anytime one of those government, one of those policy shapers needs a willing participant, they will call on Unilever, corporation that makes Vaseline, fortunately for us, as this goes forward. They make tea bags, they make everything but beef, anything that has to do anything with beef. Walmart, Nestle, Tyson, Mars, candy bars people, those guys are horrible. And Rabobank, those are all examples of business entities that are on board with the global power. Then some examples of the think tanks are the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Rockefeller Foundation, Chatham House, which is essentially the Brit, the Royal House, the Trilateral Commission, and the GRSB. So here's Jason Clay again.
We actually need collusion around sustainability at every level with every type of institution. Where do we start? Who do we work with? How do we work on these issues? This is new ground for us. So we decided we needed to map it out. There's 6.8 billion consumers, give or take, maybe closer to 7 today. Do we work with all those? Do we work with the 1.4 billion producers of all these different products? Do we change the way they produce things? Or do we focus on the narrower neck, the pinch point in each of these commodities where 300 to 500 companies control 70 to 80% of each of those 15 commodities that we care about? We decided that this is the strategy that we could actually get our arms around.
So here's the picture, the important take-home message of that little film, other than it's pretty good to demonstrate that his use of the word collusion was not an accident. For a period of time, he used it every time he talked. It was really what they needed. And then he sort of softened it, and he went, "Oh God, people are using this against me." So then it's collaboration or something after that. So the important thing in this picture that he put up was and you can see his analogy here to this wine glass, where there's the bowl is the consumer's guy. There's a whole bunch of them. There's 6 or 7 billion of them, and there's the primary producers at the bottom. There's maybe a few million of them, and there's a connection between them. And that's where you can get a hold of this thing. And that's where you can really get your hands around the throat of the supply chain. And the way you do that is with investors. Now, this was an early admission by these people that what is driving this whole process is banks and institutional investors selectively funding or defunding cooperating corporations. That's an important diagram. That's a very important diagram. So let me talk to you a little bit about what they call ESG investing. And it's all the rage. So you can pick up any, not syllabus, but say it again. Prospectus, thank you. You can pick up any prospectus and they talk about ESG investing. So that stands for environmental, social, and governance. They also call it stakeholder capitalism. They also call it investing with purpose. And it's supposed to portray this kinder, gentler capitalist pig who's not going to go rape the landscape for profit, but they're thinking about all these more gentle aspects of their business model. So, but it's running finance at the corporate level now, ESG investing. It is huge. And the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, if it's anything, is ESG investing. So I wish these guys had made a little better thing on in their magazine where I took this apart, because I had to sort of piece it together. But this is a, I've been looking at this stuff for a number of years, and I've never seen such a bold admission from a corporate, and they call it, this guy, he's a CSO, Chief Sustainability Officer. So you've heard of CFOs and CEOs, and now they got CSOs, and they all got to have them. Their banks require them to have one at the board level. So they all have a CSO now. CSO Tyson Foods, Ian McConnell, who's coincidentally president of the GRSB this year, he says right now, access to finance is by far our biggest driver for sustainability. So they fed you full of bullshit for years about how the reason that you have to do this sustainability is because consumers were demanding it. They weren't. They are not. That's not what they care about. They said it was because we got to feed 9.5 billion people in the year 2050, and God, we cared deeply about them and those poor babies then. Unborn babies at this point, or we care about those because they're going to want something to eat, and we want to be there for them. And the real answer is those corporations are doing the whole sustainability dance because if they don't, their bankers won't finance them. They will finance their competition, and they will die. This is August 8th of 2022, this article came out. Now, that is the boldest admission I've ever seen. And this is a boardroom level guy at Tyson. So access to finance, this is part of the article about the fourth paragraph. I'll read it to you because I'm sure you can't see it. It says, we have ethical investors and shareholders telling us, you need to be good, so I feel good giving you my money. We also have companies buying our shares to get votes at our board table to make sure we set and meet goals. But it's good because we will be in a position to meet consumer demands. And then we have a traceability system in Australia, but that traceability system does not enable me to tell a consumer anything about what you do. And then he says, I think it should be enabled to do that. And if there's anything we should be asking these other agencies, is to look into putting that information into their disclosures. So he would like traceability, not because they want to run down the next disease, because that's what you're going to hear too. Oh, you got to have, and you hear that from the veterinarians. Oh, we got to have mandatory traceability because we got to get a quick trace back on a disease outbreak. That's not true. They want it for this purpose, because it's like a leash on a dog, that RFID tag. Here's an example I really want to drive this point home. What's driving this whole GRSB thing is not any of that fuzzy, fluffy stuff. It's hardcore. The banks are making them do it. Okay, so here's from the United Nations Banking and Sustainability. They got, it's an 80-page book on how you're supposed to do this. Here's Tyson, there's their sustainability report, and they go on and on about this sort of thing from the receiving end of that pressure. And I'll tell you, there's another guy, it's an interesting study. His name's Mark Carney. He was president of the Canadian, basically the Federal Reserve, the central bank in Canada. Then he did so good, he went to the Bank of England, and he was the head banker there. And these guys, understand that those central banks can print money out of thin air, and they can give it to whoever they want. Now, that's a pretty good lever of power. So what do they do with this guy? But he eventually makes it to, now he's the United Nations envoy for climate change. And so you have to ask yourself, what is it about a banker who may have had a stellar career at that level? But you ask him, what is it about a banker that makes him qualified for climate science? And he doesn't have any special qualifications for climate science. What he is a master manipulator of money. So here's government. Government is the enforcer of governance. But different jurisdictions require different legal solutions. And, the GRSB talks about this a lot. They'll say, one size does not fit all. And one sustainable practice on a given ranch or farm may not be the one required other places. So we have to stay flexible. We have to be able to just apply these general principles of animal welfare and land use and so forth. We have to be able to apply that different places by using different tools. So different jurisdictions require different legal solutions. So beware the public-private partnership, because this is where they start to bring those powers to bear, and they do it differently in different jurisdictions. So they've done it differently in the Netherlands, they've done it differently in some other places. But it's important to know that it's really what they've been saying all along when they say we need flexibility is we need flexibility to control you, because you may resist something that this other nation over here might not. So why the public-private partnership? And again, this borrows from what Ian Davis was talking about. Here's why they like it, because taxpayer money goes into to fund their whole operation. And it sounds like a great idea. Well, if it's a public-private partnership, we're the public and we're saving money because this private party's dumping their money in here and, going to save us a lot of dough. They like it because there's little or no transparency. And so if you know what a FOIA request is, Freedom of Information Request, you can send that to a governmental entity and they're supposed to fork over their documents. They're supposed to let you see them because they're a government agency. But if there's a public-private partnership, suddenly that stuff all becomes the part that's of the domain of the private entity, and you don't get to see that part. You might see something that the government does, which is never anything you want to see. All that takes place in the private hands. They're immune to the FOIAs. They take our money and they draft the regulations to regulate. Okay, so they are pressuring. These corporations are pressuring, and you see it at the USDA every day. These guys are pressuring the USDA to draft regulations to regulate themselves in a way that will take advantage of you. And they call that, there's a new word for it, it's called regulatory capture. And what that means is the regulators are the regulated. They have captured the regulators. Here's an example of how things are different. Here's Ireland, okay? So here's my buddy. You want to hit that arrow?
This country, Ireland, and its producers have agreed to reduce the key impacts of production for all the products that they export. The question then becomes, why hasn't another country done that? And how soon will another country? The great thing about having one country do it is that then you can have the second country do it, and the third, and the fourth. This country, Ireland, and its producers have agreed to reduce the key impacts of production for all the products that they export. The question then becomes, why hasn't another country done that? And how soon will another country? The great thing about having one country do it is that then you can have the second country do it, and the third, and the fourth.
You talk about a smug guy. And if you could just, I don't know if it were, I've watched that film a lot of times. But the look in his eye when he's just going, oh, wouldn't it be so cool if we could get them all one at a time? So here's what happened to Ireland is that they got so dependent on exports that they isolated them and denied them the ability to do exports. And then they went to them and said, now, so what are you willing to do if you want to get your exports back? And are you willing to make this deal with this devil where you will monitor and, take care of your impacts? They said, yes, we are. So that's what they did. And they've got a organization called Board BIA that regulates them, and everything's about sustainability in Ireland. Well, let's see how that's working out for them, because this was a number of years ago. So here's the Irish Food Board. So I should have had this slide a little later, but 11,000 cattle stolen and lost and stolen in 3 years in Northern Ireland. And this is superimposed over, prior to this, like they might have 80 or something stolen. What's going on here? Because they're locked down, they have to sell, because of their ear tags, they have to sell to they call them food, meat factories, the packers. They have to sell there, and they have to disclose all their ear tag information. And then it goes to the retailers, and the retailer decides how much money they're going to get. So what these guys are doing, and it doesn't say this is what I think they're doing. This is my guess, okay? Because it's not that big a country. I mean, the real estate they're running on is pretty close to the house. And it strikes me as pretty incredible that people are stealing on this level. But so 11,000 cattle stolen in 3 years in Northern Ireland. 10, 15, 20 times more than normal. What they're doing is they're taking their own cattle and they're black marketing them to a consumer for more money than they would get from the meat factory and cheaper than the consumer will pay at the grocery store. So they're selling their animals for butcher, private treaty to consumers. Maybe their neighbors, maybe whatever. And so, these cattle are out there in the pasture. Nobody's going to know if one is missing for a while. So they can make this deal. Then they have to, as soon as they know they don't have that animal anymore, they got to report that. Or they're subject to criminal penalties. They're subject to criminal penalties if they get caught doing this too. But here's the thing, this pitiful arrangement has resulted in these God-fearing, honest farmers having to resort to criminal behavior in order to make a living. And that's what will happen to you guys too. They're black marketing their own cattle. So supermarkets, these guys are protesting all the time because the retailers and the packers are screwing them over big time. And this is all because of Board BIA, all because they do mandatory traceability. The Irish farmers campaigning for higher beef prices have blockaded a grocery store distribution center. Farmers commence second wave of beef factory protests. Meat industry mafia hurting farm families. This is real. This isn't whining. This is real. These people are fighting for their survival. Irish farmers fear livelihoods as EU overhauls agricultural subsidies. So here's one of the things that happened when they entered into this agreement to do the Board BIA. They were all promised massive subsidies. And of course, that was cheese in the trap. And it was bait and switch. So now that they're begging for what they were promised. Ireland would need, so now here comes the real deal. Okay, so Ireland's going to have to kill a bunch of, they're going to have to get rid of a bunch of cattle because they need to meet a climate goal. They've got to cut their emissions. And the only way to do it is if they get rid of their cattle. And how many do you have to get rid of before your outfit's not economically viable? You don't have to get rid of all of them. When I practiced law, I did it for a while, then I was trying to ranch. So I'd practice law part-time. What I realized practicing law part-time was all your expenses are the first part. You're the part you're working in the office, that covers your expenses. And then if you don't work the second part, you don't have any income. And that's the way it is with cattle. Your expenses, you have to be big enough to make it work. And these guys want to cut them back to the point where it won't work. And cattle in Ireland are 90% grass-fed. 90% of the cattle in Ireland are off of grass. So if you think that they aren't going to pick on you because you're a grazer and that your practices are sustainable. And they would never, I mean, they might, you know, you might feel comfortable with the belief that they're the ones that are grain fed or have heavier environmental impacts. They don't care about that. They don't care about that any more than they do feeding 9.5 billion people by 2050. They want to put you out of business. That's what they want to do. And so this is what Ireland needs to do now, is cut 1.3 million cattle to reach their climate targets, which are bullshit. Okay, the climate targets are bullshit. And I'd like to make this point while I think about it. These guys are creating a market for carbon credits. So what they're going to do, what they plan to do is these companies, because they're buying products that are carbon emitters, they're going to pay some money to ranchers for sequestering their carbon. So they go, you got this ranch out here, you got this farm, you got, you're do a little calculation here. You guys sequester so much carbon, we'll pay you for that. So a little bit of money comes from the corporation to the rancher. The rancher thinks he's cutting a fat hog because he's getting a check that he never got before. And there's a guy standing in the middle who's picking up a 30% commission. Now, if you think that money is going to continue, and you're going to hear more about those carbon credits and the carbon market, they've created this market out of nothing, the same way they did money. If you think those payments are going to continue on some kind of basis that's going to be meaningful, you are wrong. It's cheese in the trap. It's bait and switch.
The great thing about having one country do it is that then you can have the second country do it, and the third, and the fourth.
So here's Canada. Here's the second country. So most of you folks probably heard about the farmers, the Dutch farmers, and their protest movement. If you haven't, we'll get to that in a little bit. But so right on the heels of that, here's Justin Trudeau, Canadian Premier, and he's going to implement carbon climate targets, reductions for climate targets. And they're going to do that irrespective of the impact on the food production, irrespective of the income. They got to do that because it's a climate emergency. Well, this was an interesting fact. This was in July, early July. So right on the heels of the Dutch protest, he comes out with this harebrained idea. So a little known fact is that Fidel Castro and Justin's mother were pretty tight. And if you ever saw a picture of Pierre Trudeau, who was the father of modern Canada, he's this red-haired guy with a high forehead and pointy face. He doesn't look much like Pierre, but he looks a hell of a lot like Fidel Castro. And the Trudeau family worshipped communist ideology for generations now. But so this doesn't mean anything. I don't know this. I just think it's a fun fact. So here's Trudeau pushes ahead on fertilizer reduction as provinces and farmers cry foul. Do you think they care that farmers are crying foul? Do you think they care? And you saw what happened when the Canadian truckers protested the virus action. They got a bunch of those got thrown in jail. They got their money seized. The bank accounts were confiscated. You think they're more or less likely to do anything this time? So here's the connection. All right, here's the nexus. Canada has mandatory traceability that was forced on them after the BSE cow back in the late 80s. I think it was the late 80s. So they have an agency that monitors their traceability. So they are locked down to mandatory RFID. McDonald's, founding member of the GRSB, started their first pilot program in Canada. And the reason they did it, in my estimation, they didn't tell me, In my estimation, the reason they did it was because they were well on their way with their mandatory traceability. So, so they've got a pilot program, and now they're selling sustainable beef. And it's not even, I mean, their traceability is even weak, but this is all GRSB stuff that happened in Ireland. And you know that because that was Jason Clay that was promoting it. You know this because this is McDonald's that's promoting it. So see, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef certified as an operation level third-party audited certification program. So there it is. That's Canada for you. This is how they're treating Canada. So if you're a good Canadian citizen, you go, well, I guess we should be traceable. That seems like a small price to pay. This is how you get paid back for it.
The great thing about having one country do
I
it
did this too
is
much,
that
but
then you can have the second country do it, and the third, and the fourth.
so here's the third country, the Netherlands. And I don't have the sequence exactly right. So the Netherlands proposes radical plans to cut livestock numbers by almost a third. Now, you ask yourself, why in the name of Jesus would you take the most efficient farmers in the world and tell them they can't do that anymore? And then what you would necessarily have to do is outsource that food production to someplace that's less efficient. Does that even make any kind of sense? But they're going to put a bunch of these guys out of business because they're going to reduce their cattle numbers. And there's all kinds of motivation for the Netherlands government to do that. They have natural areas, and it seems to be that they're running short. Okay, I'll hurry on through. So it's a land grab. The farmers believe that. I believe that. They want to get rid of cattle off the landscape. Their attack on Netherlands is 54% godless. 54% of those people don't believe in God. But the highest percentage of these Christian farmers are the target of their animosity. But it's okay. They want to bring in housing for 1 million immigrants. That's fine. So it's important to know that the Dutch government was the funder that provided the seed money for the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. They were the one. They kicked out about $3 million US for seed money to start the GRSB. And there's language there that indicates that that's what they intended to do with it. Then there was Prince Barnard from the Netherlands, and and this stuffy bitch, wife of his, Juliana. So Prince Barnard was no slouch. He created the World Wildlife Fund, and he created the Bilderberg Group, if you know what that is. So, and here's Prince Barnard did it in cooperation with Prince Philip of England, and this is from my friend Bob Baker, World Wildlife Fund. Prince Philip wants you to lend him a hand. So the Dutch farmers' protests reap populist support. So you would think that the people in Netherlands would get tired of their blockades, and they're making their access to grocery stores difficult, but they're not. The people are supporting them. And then there's RCAF. Bill Bullard, I don't know if he's here. Bill Bullard strikes again. Bill Bullard drafted up a statement of support for the Dutch farmers because they're in protest, because they're standing up on their hind legs. Subsequently has been translated into Dutch and German. I'm going to skip that.
The great thing about...
Okay, here's the US of A. Here's how you handle these people in the US of A. You got a little different approach. The Securities and Exchange Commission has come up with a set of regulations, 500 pages of regulations, that are going to require companies that are registered on the Securities and Exchange Commission, if you're publicly traded, you have to disclose the carbon emissions in your supply chain. So they are going to be required by the SEC, and they label it a financial risk. They're going to require you to disclose to the companies your carbon risk, your carbon footprint, your carbon emissions. You're called a Scope 3 emitter. Okay, so Scope 1 is like at McDonald's, it's the store and the propane it takes to burn the hamburgers. Scope 2 is the transportation to get it there. Scope 3 is all the carbon emissions in the supply chain. That's you guys. Okay, so these regulations that they have hurried through, they're not final yet. They have hurried through, they abbreviated the comment period. There's a banker in charge of the SEC, a guy named Gensler, who's an alumni from Goldman Sachs. So the GRSB has come up with their carbon footprint guideline, and there are 45 pages of algebraic nonsense like this. And this is what they're going to ask you to do. And 45 pages look just like that in calculating your carbon footprint and whether or not you're increasing your pounds of beef produced per kilogram of carbon emitted. And here's a McDonald's diagram. This is their scope 1 there is the little wedge. Scope 2 is, I guess that's their franchises. But the rest of it, that's 71%. Those are the scope 3 emitters. And what McDonald's says is, boy, if we're going to make any headway, there's only one place to do it, and that's with you guys. And this is a long time ago, and it's a very cute little diagram. But there's evil in it clear to the core. So what do you got to do? You got to get out of debt, because those bankers are the ones that are driving this. If you can get out of debt, do it. Plan how you're going to process and retail your own beef, because there is very little or dim future in the packers right now for you guys. The demand for the beef is strong, and the margins are excellent. There's school districts, there's your local grocery store, there's your natural ally. You got to do something. You got to start thinking about that. And you got to confront the nonsense and the lies and the propaganda when these guys foist it on the consumer.